2 ounces of warm broth. That's all it took to save 7-year-old Park Min-jae's life when Amara Okoye poured her only dinner into a cracked plastic bowl and fed a dying stranger's child in a dim hallway that smelled of bleach and desperation. 25 years later, Min-jae controls a $14 billion venture capital empire, and he'd spent the last decade searching through employment records, purchasing apartment complexes, and tracking down every lead trying to find the Nigerian Maid, who refused to let him fade away when his own world had given up. He'd kept a faded photograph of the building, Unit 4B, 3rd floor East Wing, where her hands, rough from scrubbing floors, had cradled his face and promised him he would grow up to be something great. And tonight, the most powerful man in Seoul would step out of a black sedan and walk through the service entrance of the very building Amara still cleans, still working herself to exhaustion, still giving her lunch to stray dogs, still completely unaware that the skeletal boy she nursed back to health now owns the ground beneath her feet. He never forgot the woman whose kindness had no price tag. But before we see what happens when a billionaire kneels before the maid who saved him, if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button because we're exploring stories about debts that can't be measured in money, kindness that echoes across continents and decades, and how one bowl of soup can rewrite 2 destinies. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The conference room on the 63rd floor of the Hanwha Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that made Seoul look like a circuit board of lights and ambition. 12 executives sat around a table made of glass and steel, each one representing billions in assets, and not one of them dared to breathe too loudly when Park Min-jae spoke. The Jakarta expansion is premature, Min-jae said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men second-guess their life choices. Pull the team, redirect the capital to Singapore, we're done here. The room emptied in 90 seconds. His assistant, Young-hee, lingered by the door with her tablet glowing, ready to execute whatever impossible task he'd assign next. She'd worked for him for 7 years, and had learned to read the micro-expressions that most people missed. The slight tension in his jaw when a deal was about to collapse, the way his fingers drummed once against the table when he'd already made a decision. Everyone else was still debating. But today, something was different. Min-jae wasn't looking at the skyline, or the profit margins still projected on the screen behind him. He was staring at his phone, at a photograph that had no business being in the camera roll of a man who lived in the future, not the past. It was a building, old, ugly, the kind of low-rent apartment complex that developers knocked down without a second thought to make room for something that mattered. Cracked concrete, rusted railings, laundry hanging from balconies like surrender flags. Young-hee had seen him buy companies, dissolve partnerships, and move markets with a single phone call. She'd never seen him look at anything the way he was looking at that photograph. Sir, she ventured carefully. Min-jae didn't glance up. His thumb traced the edge of the screen, hovering over a 3rd-floor window, barely visible in the frame. The paint was peeling, the glass was foggy, but he was looking at it like it was the only window in the world that mattered. Find out who owns this building, he said quietly. Young-hee pulled up the image he'd already sent to her phone. The metadata told her it was located in Yeongjungpo, one of the older districts where gentrification hadn't quite reached. The building had probably been standing since the late 90s, worth less now than the land it occupied. It's owned by Deemyung Development, she said after a few taps. They're planning to demolish it next quarter. Luxury condos. Min-jae's expression didn't change, but his fingers went still against the table. Buy the building, he said. Buy the company if you have to. I want the sale finalized by Friday, and I want it done quietly. No press, no announcements. Young-hee nodded, already drafting the emails in her head, already calculating the logistical nightmare of acquiring a property that wasn't officially on the market. She didn't ask why. She'd learned a long time ago that Park Min-jae didn't make impulsive decisions. He made inevitable ones, and somewhere in that ugly, forgotten building, someone's entire world was about to change. 25 years earlier, the hallway on the 3rd floor of the Yeongjungpo apartment complex smelled like kimchi, mildew, and the particular exhaustion that settles into concrete when too many people survive in too little space. Amara Okoye's feet felt like they'd been dipped in cement. 14 hours of scrubbing other people's floors, washing other people's dishes, folding other people's lives into neat, manageable squares. Her uniform, a hand-me-down from another maid who'd gone back to the Philippines, hung loose on her frame because eating was optional when rent wasn't. She was 24 years old and felt 50. All she wanted was to unlock the door to the storage closet-turned-bedroom she shared with 2 other live-in maids, heat up the small container of rice and soup she'd saved from the family she worked for, and sleep until her bones stopped aching. That's when she saw him. The boy was crumpled against the wall, near the stairwell, like discarded laundry. His skin so pale it looked translucent under the flickering fluorescent light. He couldn't have been more than 7, maybe 8, wearing pajamas that had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly see-through. Amara's first instinct was to keep walking. She'd learned that survival in Seoul meant minding your business, keeping your head down, not getting involved in other people's tragedies because you barely had the strength to carry your own. But then the boy's eyes opened, just barely, and looked at her with the kind of emptiness that comes right before giving up. She knelt down, her knees cracking in protest. "Hey," she said softly in broken Korean, the few words she'd managed to pick up. "You okay?" He didn't answer. His lips were cracked and colorless. His breathing was shallow, irregular, like his lungs had forgotten their job. Amara pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, burning up. She looked down the hallway, waiting for a parent to appear, for someone to claim this child who was clearly dying in a place where people walked past dying things every day. But the hallway stayed empty, and the boy's eyes started to close again. She made a choice. 10 minutes later, she was sitting on the cold floor with the boy's head in her lap, spooning warm broth into his mouth from the plastic container that was supposed to be her dinner. He could barely swallow, but she was patient, tilting his head just right, waiting for his throat to remember how to work. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, knowing he probably couldn't understand her English, knowing it didn't matter. "You're going to grow up and be something great, I promise you." The boy's eyes focused on her face for just a moment, and she saw something flicker there, not gratitude exactly, but recognition, like he was memorizing her. Then he fell asleep in her arms while she sat there, hungry, holding a stranger's child, wondering if kindness was supposed to cost this much. Amara's hands told the story her mouth never would. 50 years of life had left their mark in the scars that crisscrossed her knuckles, the chemical burns that had faded to pale shadows on her wrists, the calluses that had built up like armor against decades of bleach and scalding water and surfaces that didn't care how tired you were. She was the head housekeeper now, which sounded impressive until you realized it just meant she was responsible for more floors, more complaints, more impossible standards set by people who'd never cleaned anything in their lives. The building hadn't changed much in 25 years. Different tenants, same peeling paint. Different management company, same indifference to the people who kept the place from falling apart completely. Amara was in the third-floor supply closet, counting inventory on a clipboard that had been old when she'd started working here. When she heard his voice behind her, "You're behind schedule again, Okoye." Lee Junseok was 28, wore suits that cost more than her monthly salary, and had been appointed building manager 6 months ago by the development company that had recently purchased the property. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about where his next meal was coming from. The fourth-floor bathrooms took longer than expected, Amara said without turning around, keeping her voice level professional. "There was a leak that needed." "I don't need excuses," Junseok interrupted. Stepping closer, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and overwhelming. "I need efficiency. The new owners have standards, and frankly, I'm not sure you're capable of meeting them." Amara's jaw tightened, but she kept counting. 16 bottles of floor cleaner, 11 rolls of paper towels. "I've been meeting standards in this building for 25 years, she said quietly. "Yes, and that's exactly the problem." Junseok plucked the clipboard from her hands. "You're old, you're slow, you smell like chemicals. The residents have complained." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The residents barely noticed her, which was exactly how housekeepers survived, by being invisible, efficient, and gone before anyone had to acknowledge your humanity. "I just need to make it to retirement," Amara said, hating the pleading edge that crept into her voice. 2 more years, that's all." Junseok smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made her feel like she was 7 years old again in Lagos, standing in front of people who had the power to erase her. 2 years is a long time, Okoye. A lot can happen, policies can change, positions can be restructured. He handed back the clipboard. "I'd work faster if I were you." He left, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile she'd mopped that morning. Amara stood there, surrounded by bottles of cleaning solution and the weight of a quarter-century spent making other people's spaces habitable, and wondered if kindness had been worth the cost after all. Min-jae had worn a baseball cap, plain jeans, and a jacket that cost $3,000 but looked like it came from a street market. The disguise was unnecessary. 25 years and 100 pounds of muscle had turned him into someone completely unrecognizable from the skeletal boy who'd nearly died on these floors. But he wore it anyway. Old habits from a childhood spent invisible. He'd been sitting in the lobby for 40 minutes, pretending to wait for someone, watching the building's rhythm. The elevator that still groaned like it was being tortured. The flickering light fixture in the northeast corner that no one had bothered to fix. The smell of a dozen different dinners cooking behind closed doors. Young-hee had offered to accompany him, but he'd refused. Some pilgrimages you had to make alone. Then he saw her. She came through the service entrance carrying a mop bucket, moving with the careful efficiency of someone whose body had learned to ration energy across long shifts. Her hair was streaked with gray now, pulled back in the same practical bun he remembered. Her uniform was different, navy blue instead of the faded brown from decades ago. But it hung on her the same way, loose in places that should have had more substance. Min-jae's chest tightened. She set the bucket down near the entrance and pulled out a small plastic container from her bag. Lunch, probably. She sat on the bottom step of the stairwell, the same stairwell where she'd found him dying, and opened the container. Rice, a few pieces of vegetables, maybe some kimchi. Not enough, never enough. Min-jae watched her take one small bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, like she was calculating whether she could afford the calories she was consuming. Then she paused. A stray dog had appeared from somewhere, mangy, limping, the kind of animal that survived in the margins of the city by begging and stealing. It sat a respectful distance away, watching her with the patient desperation that Min-jae recognized from his own childhood. Amara looked at the dog, looked at her lunch, looked back at the dog. Min-jae already knew what she was going to do. She pinched off half her rice, most of her vegetables, and held it out. The dog approached cautiously, took the food gently from her scarred hands, and retreated to eat in the corner. Amara smiled, a small, tired thing that didn't quite reach her eyes, and went back to eating what remained, which wasn't much, which had never been much. Min-jae sat frozen in his chair, watching a woman who'd spent 25 years giving away pieces of herself to anyone who needed them more. And he felt something crack open in his chest that $14 billion had never been able to touch. She hadn't changed at all, still feeding the starving, still working herself to exhaustion, still treating every broken thing like it deserved to survive, still completely unaware that the boy she'd saved was sitting 15 feet away, trying not to cry behind his $3,000 disguise. Min-jae waited until Amara had finished her half portion of lunch and returned to mopping the lobby floor. He watched her work for another 10 minutes, the methodical back-and-forth motion of someone who'd cleaned 1,000,000 floors and would clean 1,000,000 more, each stroke precise despite the exhaustion written into her posture. Then he stood, timing his movement for when she'd turned her back, and let his wallet slip from his jacket pocket. It hit the tile with a sound that was softer than it should have been. Leather against stone, unremarkable. He kept walking toward the entrance, counting his steps 1, 2, 3. "Excuse me." Her voice carried the same gentle firmness he remembered from 25 years ago. Accented English wrapped around Korean phrasing, still doing her best to communicate across the language barrier that had never quite closed. Min-jae turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral. Amara was hurrying toward him, her right hand clutching the mop for balance, her left holding his wallet like it was something fragile and dangerous. She was breathing harder than she should have been from such a short distance, and Min-jae noticed the slight wheeze in her exhale. How many hours had she worked today? How many days had she worked without rest? "You dropped this," she said, extending the wallet toward him. Min-jae took it, deliberately letting his fingers brush against her scarred knuckles. Her hands were colder than they should have been. "Thank you," he said in Korean, keeping his voice low, unremarkable. He opened the wallet slowly, making a show of checking the contents. 800,000 won in cash, visible and untouched. 3 credit cards with limits that could buy this entire building. A photo of his mother, the only person from his childhood who'd tried, even when trying hadn't been enough. Everything was there. "I should give you a reward," Min-jae said, pulling out 200,000 won. Amara stepped back like he'd offered her poison. "No, no," she said quickly, her hands up in refusal. "I was just returning what's yours." "That's what people should do." Min-jae looked at her directly for the first time since she'd called out to him, really looked at her, and what he saw made his carefully constructed composure nearly crack. The tiredness in her eyes wasn't the kind that came from a single long shift. It was the kind that had been accumulating for decades, layer upon layer of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch anymore. It was the tiredness of someone who'd been surviving so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to actually live. And underneath that tiredness was something worse, a quiet resignation, like she'd already accepted that this was all there would ever be. Mop buckets and chemical burns, and counting down the days until retirement that might never come. She was 50 years old and looked 70, and it was because she'd spent her entire life giving away pieces of herself to people who never gave anything back. "Please," Min-jae said softly, still holding out the money. "You've earned it." Amara shook her head, already turning back to her mop bucket. "I haven't earned anything I didn't work for," she said. "Have a good day." Then she returned to cleaning floors for people who would never know her name. The notice was taped to Amara's door when she finished her shift at 11 p.m. Printed on company letterhead that was too clean and official to mean anything good. Her hands shook as she peeled it off, leaving a residue of adhesive that she'd probably be expected to clean tomorrow. Except there might not be a tomorrow. Notice of immediate termination and eviction. Employee Amara Okoye. Position head housekeeper. Effective 24 hours from posting. The words blurred together as she read them once, twice, 3 times, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. 25 years of perfect attendance, of staying late without overtime, of covering shifts for colleagues who had families and lives outside these walls. 25 years, and it came down to a single piece of paper taped to a door at the end of a 14-hour day. Due to upcoming renovations and restructuring, your position has been eliminated. You are required to vacate your live-in quarters within 24 hours. Any personal belongings remaining after this period will be disposed of. Amara's legs gave out, and she sat down right there in the hallway, her back against the door that had been the only home she could afford for a quarter of a century. The storage closet-turned bedroom behind that door contained everything she owned. A narrow bed with sheets she'd washed 1,000 times, a plastic drawer unit with her clothes, a hot plate she wasn't technically supposed to have, a shoebox with letters from her sister in Lagos, photographs of nieces and nephews she'd never met, and a small amount of money she'd been saving for the retirement that was supposed to come in 2 years. 2 years she'd been so close. Footsteps approached from down the hall, and she looked up to see Lee Junseok standing over her with that same smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You received the notice, I see," he said. 25 years, Amara heard herself say, her voice coming from somewhere far away. "I gave this building 25 years. And the new owners appreciate your service," Junseok said with practiced sympathy that rang hollow. "But the building is being converted to luxury condos. We need to bring in staff that better reflects the caliber of residents we're targeting. I'm sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She was old, foreign, and disposable. She'd always been disposable. She just allowed herself to forget for a little while. "Where am I supposed to go?" The question came out smaller than she intended. Junseok shrugged. "There are shelters. Government assistance programs. You'll figure something out. You've survived this long." He walked away, his expensive shoes echoing in the hallway she'd mopped that morning, leaving her sitting on the floor with a notice in her trembling hands and 24 hours to dismantle a life. Amara sat there until the tears stopped coming, until the hallway went quiet, until she was alone with the exhaustion that had finally caught up with her. She'd spent her whole life feeding people who were starving. Now she had nowhere to sleep and no one to feed her back. Amara was carrying the last of her belongings in 2 garbage bags when Lee Junseok found her in the lobby the next morning. She'd packed through the night, moving with the numb efficiency of someone who'd learned to survive one catastrophe at a time. "You're cutting it close," Junseok said, checking his watch with theatrical impatience. "You have 2 hours left, and I need you out of here before the contractors arrive." Amara nodded, adjusting her grip on the bags. Everything she owned in the world reduced to trash bags. "I just need to—" "I don't care what you need," Junseok interrupted, his voice rising. "You're trespassing now. You're no longer an employee, which means you have no business being in this building. Do you understand? You're nothing here. You've always been nothing." A few residents had stopped to watch, keeping their distance, their faces showing the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to get involved. Amara felt something inside her finally break, the last structural beam that had been holding up decades of quiet endurance. "I fed people in this building," she said, her voice shaking. "I took care of." "You cleaned toilets," Junseok snapped. "Don't romanticize it." That's when the first sedan pulled up outside. Then the second, then the third. 5 black Mercedes sedans, the kind that diplomats and corporate executives traveled in, arranged in a formation that blocked the entire entrance. The lobby went silent. Even Junseok stopped mid-sentence. The doors opened in synchronized precision, and men in dark suits stepped out, security. Clearly, though they didn't have the aggression of typical bodyguards, they moved with the quiet efficiency of people who'd never needed to prove anything. Then Min-jae stepped out of the center vehicle. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Amara made in a year, his presence commanding in a way that made everyone in the lobby instinctively straighten their posture. He walked through the entrance like he owned it, which Amara would learn in approximately 30 seconds. He did. Junseok's face went pale. Min-jae didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance in his direction. He walked straight toward Amara, his eyes locked on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. And then, in front of everyone, Park Min-jae, billionaire venture capitalist, the man who made markets move with a single phone call, knelt down on the lobby floor she'd mopped 1,000 times. He knelt at her feet. "Amara Okoye," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. 25 years ago, you fed a dying boy in a hallway upstairs. You gave him your only meal. You promised him he would grow up to be something great. Amara stared at him, her garbage bag slipping from her hands. "I was that boy," Min-jae said, "and I've been looking for you ever since." The restaurant occupied the top 3 floors of the lot tower, the kind of place where reservations were made 6 months in advance, and a single meal cost more than Amara used to make in a month. She sat across from Min-jae at a table by the window, Seoul spreading out below them like a galaxy of lights, and felt completely untethered from reality. The past 2 hours had been a blur. Min-jae firing Lee Junseok on the spot. Min-jae halting all renovations. Min-jae's quiet insistence that she come with him, that they needed to talk, that he had something to show her. Now she was here, still wearing her housekeeper's uniform because she hadn't had time to change, surrounded by crystal and fine china, and people who belonged in places like this. She didn't. "I don't understand," Amara said for the 5th time since they'd sat down. "Why go through all this trouble? It was just soup, It wasn't just soup," Min-jae said quietly. "It was my life." A server approached with a single bowl on a tray, setting it down in front of Amara, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for rare wines. She looked down and felt her heart stop. It was the soup, her soup. The exact same simple broth with vegetables and rice that she'd given to a dying boy 25 years ago, served in a bowl that was fancier, but held the same humble ingredients. The chef had recreated it perfectly, down to the way the green onions floated on the surface. "How did you—" "I remembered every detail," Min-jae said. "The taste, the temperature, the way you blew on each spoonful before feeding it to me because it was too hot and you were afraid I'd burn my mouth." Tears were running down Amara's face before she could stop them. Min-jae reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, aged and worn, the edges soft from being handled too many times. "Do you remember taking a boy to the free clinic 3 days after you found him in the hallway?" he asked. Amara nodded slowly. She'd almost forgotten. The boy had developed a fever, and his parents, she'd finally met them, exhausted factory workers who couldn't afford to miss shifts, had been paralyzed with fear and poverty. So she'd taken him herself, paid the clinic fee with money she'd been saving for a new pair of shoes. Min-jae opened the envelope and spread the contents on the table. Medical receipts, dated 25 years ago, the clinic's stamp still visible, and at the bottom, a payment receipt for 47,000 won, signed in her handwriting. "You paid for everything," Min-jae said. "My parents didn't know. They thought the clinic had done it for free. But I found these years later, when I was going through old papers. I found your signature and I started searching." He looked at her with eyes that held 2 decades of gratitude. "You didn't just feed me, Amara. You saved me 3 times, the soup, the clinic, and the promise that I would be something great." His voice cracked. "You made me believe I deserved to survive." 6 months later, Amara stood in front of a room full of people who actually wanted to hear what she had to say. The conference center in Geneva was nothing like the lobbies she'd spent her life cleaning. Delegates from 40 countries sat in chairs that didn't creak, taking notes on tablets that cost more than her old annual salary, listening to her talk about something she'd never thought mattered to anyone but herself. Kindness, hunger, the economics of a single meal. The Okoye Foundation for Global Nutrition had launched 3 months ago with an endowment that made international headlines. $2 billion dedicated to feeding children who were falling through the cracks, to supporting the invisible workers who kept the world running, to proving that every act of kindness created ripples that could reshape entire futures. And Amara, who'd spent 50 years being invisible, was the chairperson. "We don't just provide meals," she said into the microphone, her accented English now a mark of authenticity rather than otherness. "We provide dignity, we see people. We remember that every child who's starving today could be the person who changes the world tomorrow. But only if someone feeds them first." The audience applauded, and Amara still wasn't used to it, still half expected someone to tell her she needed to get back to mopping. Min-jae sat in the front row, watching her with the same quiet intensity he'd had since the day he'd knelt at her feet. He'd wanted to make her a silent beneficiary, to set her up in comfort without asking anything in return. But Amara had refused. "I'm not done working," she'd told him. I'm just done cleaning other people's floors. Let me feed people, that's what I know how to do. So they'd built this together, a foundation that hired former housekeepers, maids, and domestic workers as program directors, because they understood hunger in ways that economists never would. That established feeding programs in apartment complexes, shelters, and neighborhoods where children still collapsed in hallways, while the world walked past. After the presentation, a young woman approached Amara, maybe 19, wearing a volunteer badge from Lagos. "My mother was a maid," the girl said quietly. "She sent money home so I could go to school. She died last year, still cleaning hotels." Her eyes were bright with tears. She would have loved knowing someone like her was running something like this. Amara pulled the girl into a hug and felt the weight of 25 years finally shift into something that made sense. That evening, Min-jae's children, 2 boys, ages 7 and 9, sat at Amara's dinner table in the home Min-jae had bought her, the one with the garden and the kitchen big enough to cook for an army. She served them soup, simple, warm, made with love. "My father says you saved his life," the older boy said. Amara smiled, watching them eat, watching them grow. "No, sweetheart," she said. "He saved mine, we saved each other." And somewhere in Seoul, in an apartment building that would never be demolished, former housekeepers were cooking meals for children who needed someone to see them, to feed them, to promise them they would grow up to be something great. The cycle continued, kindness echoing across decades, across continents, across every hallway where someone decided that another person's hunger mattered more than their own. If this story reminded you that no act of kindness is ever wasted, hit that subscribe button. We're building a collection of stories about debts that can't be measured in money, about dignity that survives decades of invisibility, and about how a single bowl of soup can rewrite 2 destinies. There are more stories on the channel about people who give when they have nothing left to give, and about the moment when the world finally gives back. Leave a comment and tell me what resonated with you, your thoughts, your own story of unexpected kindness. Anything, we read them all, and your words matter here. Thank you for spending this time with Amara and Min-jae. I'll see you in the next story.